Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scot McKay.
All right, gentlemen, welcome yet again to another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. As always, I am your host, Scot McKay, at Scot McKay on Twitter and on YouTube and on TikTok and on Truth Social and pretty much everywhere else except Instagram, where I'm at Real Scot McKay. The website is mountaintoppodcast.com. And as always, the group of thriving guys on Facebook can be found at the Mountaintop Summit. With me today is a third-time returning guest. He is from Europe. He moves about in Europe, which is always a lot of fun and exciting. Great adventure. One that I miss, actually. I'm starting to miss Europe and want to go back myself as soon as I can. His name is Michael Lassen, of course, and he's one of the smart guys who come on this show and really is a deep thinker and tends to come up with new and interesting ideas that either involve something that none of the rest of us have really been thinking about much lately, if at all, or I should say, kind of expounding upon something everybody thinks about in a way that nobody has thought about yet. So either way, it's exciting. Sometimes it's a little bit of both, but it's always a wonderful show when my good friend Michael Lassen joins us. Michael, welcome back, man.
Thank you so much, Scott. It's great to be back a third time.
Yeah, man, you betcha. It's my pleasure because, man, guys just rave about these shows when you and I get to talking about all these exciting, interesting topics that really no one else is discussing. So when you came to me with this idea of love and freedom and putting love and freedom first, it, of course, piqued my interest for several reasons. First of all, I think one of the greatest, aspirations of any real masculine man who wants to be a leader, who wants to be a provider and a protector, is he's got to be a free man. He can't be at the whim of someone else. He can't be under someone else's thumb. He has to be able to come and go as he pleases, make his own decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, love. I mean, we're all interested in getting better with women around here. And obviously, even though there's only one word for love in the English language, it's a well-known fact that in other languages there are multiple words for love. And so it gets a little confused around here. But, you know, we as men obviously love women, at least we hope so, and we want to be better with women. So I just don't know how something called love freedom can possibly go wrong. So, Michael, man, the mic is yours. Just tell us what you got going on and, spread the joy of just these amazing new topics you've been thinking about lately.
Yeah, so picking up from our last conversation where we talked about a success checklist or life's golden checklist,
we certainly did, yes.
Is one of the things we talked about is that the ideal thing in a checklist is to make it as brief, as simple as possible. And then when I thought about it, I went, well, if I could come up with the simplest checklist that could work for decision making, what would it be? And it was just that. It was, if we put love and freedom first, if we literally use that as a, northern light or whatever you want to call it in terms of decision making, we are probably going to end up in a good place because, like you just described, it's essential to our life and to our, happiness is putting love and freedom first. So that was the initial spark that led to a complete new direction in my life, really. And going anywhere from me making the decision personally to put my own love, which includes self-love first and freedom, and giving myself permission to follow my heart, which is the ultimate symbol of love, of course, but also follow the freedom of wherever that would lead me. And one of the definitions I think that needs to be within freedom is that you are not attached to outcomes, specific outcomes. We can have goals. We can have goal-setting workshops and accountability and obsession me this, obsession me that, or whatever. But ultimately, unless we have a non-detachment to specific outcomes, that we're open to something that's even better, potentially, then I don't think that's freedom. And so that led me to, for the first time, allow myself to follow my passion for songwriting and for becoming a performing singer-songwriter. So it had that effect right off the bat in terms of me allowing myself to follow that passion. But also what I found is a really interesting thing that I also recommend both women, but especially guys, is allowing yourself to look for how to combine your passions. So I had, like we talked about last time, lifelong compassion for personal development, growth, transformation, whatever you want to call it. And then this music thing came up, and I'm like, well, that's not typically combined. I mean, you don't see Tony Robbins whip out a Gibson guitar and start playing songs for 10,000 people in his live programs. And you don't see Ed Sheeran on TED Talk and so on and so forth. But then I realized, well, if I could combine these two passions, how would I? And that allowed me to go in a completely new direction and come up with some things that we can talk about a little later in the show.
Yeah, man, absolutely. The first thing I caught was what you said right at the beginning, which is this acts as kind of a northern light. And I had to chuckle a little bit because you're originally from Norway. And it occurs to me that you guys use the term northern light as we would use guiding light.
Yeah.
You kind of see it as like the wayfarer's guide in a dark night, you know. I think that's fascinating. I think that's wonderful. You know, everything you're talking about resonates with me so strongly in many ways because, well, first of all, I've been doing a lot of those things. I mean, if subconsciously to some degree, or not quite with the level of consciousness you have for many years now. Unfortunately, nowadays, Michael, it seems like everybody's either all in or they're all out. It's black and white. There is no gray area. There is no middle ground. There is no compromise. I lay the blame for that in many ways at the feet of social media and how people get in their own little echo chambers and decide that everybody who disagrees with them is the enemy. But I also think it's, well, from a human nature perspective, very convenient to compartmentalize everything. It just means you get to lock down whatever your preconceived notion is about it, kind of stick to your guns from there and move on if necessary, or when it needs to be revisited, just dust off your preconceived notion once again. And I think that really does a disservice to us both in freedom and in love, because first of all, if we're being handed our opinions and told what to believe by someone else, how is that even remotely tied to freedom? And second of all, it's not very loving to your fellow men to treat them as if there's something wrong with them simply because their opinion is different. And what's occurring to me as you talk is sometimes it's largely due to pure laziness. In other words, we don't want to confront our potential ignorance or learn something today, so we just basically are mean to someone, dismiss them, and move on. And yet, like I told you, I've been sort of practicing what you're talking about to some relatively rudimentary degree, for sure, for years now. Like take, for example, when guys sign up with me for coaching, we don't just sit down and discuss what happened randomly every time they take time out of their life to schedule a session with me. Rather, what we do is we have a planning process up front where we put together a strategy, a plan of action that takes one from here to there. But, hey, life happens while you're making other plans, right? Famously. So perhaps a majority of the time, even though that plan of, say, 10 topics for example, a 10-plus program, as I've branded it, sometimes you get through the fifth or sixth topic, and for whatever reason, we need to adjust them. You know, something happens where a guy comes to me and he wants to meet more women. Then by the fifth or sixth topic, he's met the woman of his dreams. So obviously we need to adjust. So I love this idea of, yes, building a checklist, having a plan, but also giving yourself the freedom to, well, maybe decide you love something else more. Am I onto something?
Yeah. And I love that you sort of picked up on using the word gray. Because as I see it, the world has become far more gray the last couple of years, despite some people coloring their hairs all colors of the rainbow. But let's not go into that. But
especially their gray hairs. Yeah.
yeah, that's even worse potentially. If you are judgmental in any way, which I am not, obviously.
Obviously.
just kidding. No, but that's a really important topic, I think, is that you want to use the concept and your definitions for love and freedom to turn your life and your journey into something colorful. and not be part of the mass of gray. I mean, one of my songs, the chorus is that they say that I'm colorblind. I don't care what they say. You're my favorite color in a world full of gray. And to me, life is, I have to admit, I'm proud of that one because there's so much gray out there. And one of the things that makes you stand out is to be colorful. And the best way to be colorful is to be tapped into your passion and to be tapped into making your decisions through the concept of love and freedom. Which is also something we've seen, obviously, in the world the last couple of years, is that there's been documented a lot of focus on creating fear and creating control. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist in any way, but I also realized that insisting on everybody utilizing love and freedom first, it's literally going to make the planet a better place, and it's going to be the antidote to all the insanity we've seen in terms of fear-inducing and control mechanisms that's been in place all over the world. So that's also what makes me so excited, is that this is something that's good for everything, for everybody in all contexts. That respecting and putting love and freedom first that's really only upside to it.
Yeah, there are a lot of people out there trying to affect our freedom and our love and indeed our happiness. Our fulfillment, whatever you want to call it, however you want to position it, by telling us we need to believe certain things and promoting certain narratives. And we don't get political often on this show, but you use the magic phrase conspiracy theory. And one thing that has become apparent to a lot of people over the course of the last few years especially is that when something is deemed to be a conspiracy theory, that's really just jargon for the truth that the other side's narrative is most afraid of.
Yeah.
And that goes for both sides. But, you talked about several very, very interesting things there. First of all, this idea of love being attacked by a culture of fear kind of gets down to that soft science of branding love as the opposite of fear.
Yeah.
Kind of like they do in Eastern religion. And I've kind of sort of realized is rather true, even from a Judeo-Christian perspective. I mean, if the good Lord, God Almighty, whatever you want to call him, is the author of that which is good, and sin is the perversion thereof, well then, is it evil that is the opposite, or is evil really just a subset of fear to begin with? Because love is the absence of fear. We had a wonderful show that I've talked about before. After the fact on this podcast, I brought it up and referred to it several times, where Alex Allman and I talked about what true love really means in the context of a relationship with a woman. And when you stop being afraid of her, then you're free to love her. That's what it's all about. So I loved that. The other thing that I think is worth a little bit of conversation here is how you talked about everything being gray and actually bringing more color into your life. Emily and I were once in Germany traveling, and we had a hotel room that was on a rather high level, and there was a huge parking lot behind the hotel, and it was full of cars and SUVs. Every single car in the parking lot was in grayscale. It was either charcoal gray, silver, white, black, like some kind of, at best, champagne-ish color. And there was one Audi that was yellow, like a bright yellow Audi in the whole lot. And I joked with my wife, because I love to hear her giggle, so I'm looking for jokes all the time, right? I said, there's the guy who does. I said, yeah, there's the rebel. There's the guy who doesn't fit in. And she started laughing. But it's kind of true. The one guy who dared in a place like Germany to buy the yellow car is the guy who's choosing to stand out. And whether this is a person who's self-aggrandizing, like, hey, look at me, or they just are iconoclastic and refusing to march to the same drummer as everybody else, it's still very interesting that the vast, vast majority of the people want to drive something gray. Now, how does that relate to women? Well, I firmly believe that women will follow men's leads. And like most men, most women will kind of slot themselves into being culturally compliant. We're going to, we want to fit in with everybody else. And so in a world where I just kind of pronounce that people are either thinking in black or white, a lot of people who really are the scared ones and would rather just stay out of the fray are choosing to form no opinion at all. And to me, that's like the great gray area in capital letters, you know. But
yeah, because if you mix black and white, it turns gray.
Yes, exactly. Or if you avoid it at all, I don't know what happens. It just kind of fades to black, I suppose. But, you know, we can't mix our analogies there. We got to pick and choose our battles. But here's my point. As children, our toys are brightly colored to stimulate our young minds, et cetera, et cetera. You don't really see a whole lot of grayscale toys for little kids. I mean, you look in a kid's play box and it's all Klein blue and bright yellow and red. And here's the thing. I don't think women in particular ever really outgrow that. I think if you bring something colorful to a woman's life, like a bouquet of flowers, you know, the most stereotypical
100%.
example of all, or a beautiful dress that's brightly colored. Women just delight in that. It's almost like you've awakened this corner of their femininity because you've all of a sudden become this wonderful masculine iconoclast against against gray world, you know?
Yeah. And how easy is it? I mean, we all know it. We all know it, and still the majority of men don't utilize that simple thing. Some potentially even because they think, oh, that's too easy. Well, that doesn't make it bad. On the contrary, everything that has color, that has, like we talk about, love and freedom into it, more of that. And like we talked about also previously with checklists, one of the most powerful things about checklists is that you remind yourself of doing what works. Like nobody has ever used a checklist and not having improved their performance. It's impossible. So, I mean, if we were to create a ideal man behavior checklist, flowers should be on it, 100%.
Well, you know what's interesting about what you just said is you're getting right to the kernel of masculine operating system, right? And it's primal. It's well established that men love to simplify things. We don't like things that are complicated. Once we get our system in place, once we engineer a way that works, we like to stick to it. So this idea of something being, outside of our systemic way of doing things, yet seeming either too easy or too good to be true, really does throw a wrench in our machine, doesn't it? Anything that's kind of been, hiding in plain sight right before our very eyes for any considerable amount of time just throws us a total curveball. Yet so many times it's really true. And this idea of, I've been living in grayscale for 10 years. Hey, why not just mix in some color? And a guy perhaps may be really struggling to wrap his head around that just because, he hasn't thought about it lately. You know, it's almost like why we as guys need mentors and we need, men's groups or people to bounce all of our different ideas off of instead of kind of just living in solitude, because a lot of other people might be able to see our forest for the trees and help us see those things that have been hiding in plain sight, you know?
Yeah, and I also think one thing that we've talked about previously as well, and I know you're big on, is the whole concept of the comfort zone. And I like to talk about the growth zone too, which is everything that's outside the comfort zone. And that's where all the color is typically, not exclusively, but in the growth zone, outside the comfort zone, that's where you're going to create new stuff. Like you mentioned that, so it's built into our nature to be a little bit of skeptical and resistant to all that. But that's also where the magic can happen. That's where the new colors come into play. And also where I believe it's really important that we demonstrate leadership, also like we talked about before, in terms of appreciating and having gratitude for ourselves, of having the courage to do that. Courage being that it's not that you're not necessarily as afraid of something, but you do it anyway. And if you do it from a position of wanting more love and freedom for yourself and others and step into that, then, that's where life becomes really interesting. And that's where you can experience new things and be the true leader that all, at least amazing women are either looking for or resonating on a much deeper level with than all, the gray type of dating, Tinder and what have you that's out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, perhaps courage is at the top of the list of what's hiding in plain sight for most men. we're doing everything that we've been doing. And, it's not going terrifically. It's not going poorly. The status quo isn't painful enough to get me to change anything for the better, because the risk that if I try to change and it goes worse is potentially painful enough that I don't do anything. Right? So most men kind of sit around and do what they've always done and tell themselves that they're content and happy. And I mean, let's hear it for gratitude. No doubt. But I did an entire group coaching program called Unsettled, where the challenge inherently was to mess up your life, disrupt your life in the best way possible, because otherwise you could die here. You could do the same thing you did yesterday for the rest of your life. And as I once heard a Baptist preacher say, pamper yourself into mediocrity. Which is just a wonderful turn of phrase.
Yeah.
And men shouldn't be pampering themselves at all. I mean, the battle cry of the hyper masculine nowadays is do hard things. And, I have said already out loud that, hey, doing hard things doesn't necessarily only mean lifting weights and doing jujitsu and doing a Tough Mudder and throwing telephone poles around for fun. It also means mental toughness. It means grit. It means facing your demons. It means facing this thing that you're procrastinating on because you fear the outcome. You fear what's going to happen. You fear failure. You may even fear success. All of that is hard also, and it involves exactly what you're talking about, Michael, which is getting out of your comfort familiarity zone and exercising a modicum of courage finally in your life. And, what if that were at the top of the checklist, even though it's, again, been hiding in plain sight all this time, right?
Yeah, and one thing I would add to when you talk about the fear of change that many people have at some point or in some context is that I would invite people to do a little bit of experimentation and using the word expand instead. So instead of thinking about, I have to change this, I have to expand my opportunities. I have to expand my palette of behaviors, for example, because expansion is less threatening to the status quo, which, ties into fight and flight and all kinds of deep lying stuff. But if you use the expansion metaphor instead of the change metaphor, that can make it a little bit easier to begin with, because then you're not denying yourself the opportunity of going back into old patterns, which might even have some use at some point. You're expanding, so you have new opportunities, you have new ways of developing yourself, you have expansion, which also ties into freedom, and it also ties into love, because all love really starts with self-love. I mean, it's a good old metaphor, the good old cliche even, is that if you don't love yourself, it's very, very difficult to love others. And you can't love yourself if you can't put yourself in an opportunity for expansion where you're going to discover more about yourself. It might be fucking scary when it happens, but you really have to lean into that, because that's the expansion. That's where a lot of the color is. And that's where you can learn stuff that you need to in order to get to the next level, or like we talked about before, in order to live up to what you're looking for in the woman that you're after, or the woman you're currently with.
Yeah, I think I can buy into most of what you're saying, at least to some degree. I would caution that perhaps there is a gray area to follow along the same theme we've been tracking with here. When it comes to what you're calling expansion versus what I mentioned, which is change. I mean, I go back to the Obama campaign from 2008, where pretty much anybody who wasn't George W. Bush running against him would have won that presidential election. And Obama, who is a student of social skill and psychology and certainly even neurolinguistic programming, very wisely adopted a campaign slogan that was one word: change. Now, interestingly, the Obama campaign instinctively realized, at the doorstep of being historically the first Black American president, and of course having a candidate with wonderful personal charisma who was easy to like, which, whether you're on the right side of the aisle or the left side of the aisle, Obama is a very personable dude. You can't help but think you can have a beer with this guy. But they knew that if he were to elaborate on that simple one-word slogan at all, it would actually hurt the campaign. It would cost votes. It's like, well, wait a minute, Barack, what are you going to change? What is this change about? What are you changing? Well, he avoided answering that. It's just like, look, we're just not going to do what the last guy did. Come on board, right?
Yeah.
Now, the problem with that is that's exactly how Pol Pot ascended to power in Cambodia. Well, we're going to change things around here. People were like, well, good God, man, it can't be any worse than the last guy. Well, they found out sooner than later, it can get a lot worse. Pol Pot basically murdered a third of his population. So change for change's sake, I'm 1,000% in agreement with you. Why disrupt something just because we haven't disrupted anything lately? I'm on board with that. But if we have bad habits or things that are tying us down or holding us back or wrecking our ability to relate to women, or we're drinking too much, or we're eating all the wrong foods and we're getting fat and we're not taking care of our health, well, then I don't know if we need to expand on that as much as have a radical shift.
No, not on the thing, but expand our opportunities and our choices of behavior.
Okay. Yeah, let me finish. I'm coming to the part where I agree with you now, okay?
All right.
However, I do think it's short-sighted only to talk about what needs to get the old heave-ho and needs to be, flat out transformed into something else. Certainly we talk about evolution around here too, which is that expansion. I see those words as at least somewhat synonymous. If I'm becoming a better man by adding to what I'm already doing right or improving upon some of the things that I'm on track with, I think that's more in line with what you're talking about. And, if I'm wrong, shout me down. But what I would say in response to that is I indeed believe, Michael, we talk way too little about that. I think that is an underexplored corner of masculine development is, what can we add to? Not that I need to go stop being a pussy and do Brazilian jiu-jitsu starting tomorrow, but it's like, okay, well, I already like motorcycles. What can I do to be a better man having to do with the motorcycles I already like working with? Something that simple.
That's a good example.
Yeah, well, it's an example, but I'm sure you would have perhaps deeper ones or ones that would allow us to expand our minds a little bit to understand the concept.
So you mentioned alcohol, for example. So I deeply respect and admire the people who've gotten results from 12 steps, and that's great, and nobody can take anything away from that. What I see as a tricky thing about that specifically is the thing that they actually put in the suggestion that if you have one drink, then everything is lost, basically. So what I like is that
fearing the zero, right?
Yeah, this is not about having people not doing what's good for them. It's having the choice. So if somebody decides that they're never going to drink alcohol again, that's perfectly fine. I still like to have the choice to be able to do it. So let's say that there's some crazy scenario where I invited on a golf trip with Elon Musk, and he says, you know what, let's discuss this super deal partnership over a beer. I'm not going to say no, just as an example. And I really believe that in all cases, it's a good thing to have the choice. And then you have the wisdom. And if you tap into utilizing putting love and freedom first as your criteria, well, you're never going to go wrong if you have a lot of different opportunities from past behaviors.
Yeah, well, what you just talked about is in wonderful alignment with this freedom you speak of.
Yeah, because it's not freedom only having one choice in a given situation.
Yes, 100%.
It might be smart.
I'm 100% in agreement with you, and I'm right there with you. In fact, I'm reminded of the work of David Shade. And, of course, his life's work is devoted to giving women incredible pleasure as a man, as a sexually dominant man. And everything he teaches to the letter works like gangbusters, whether you like it or not. I mean, sometimes guys have to wrap their heads around the nature of masculinity relative to how it turns on femininity in bed. That's the subject of previous podcasts. But one thing that David Shade said in response to the Me Too movement several years ago, as a man who's actively teaching guys how to have sex with women, is he said it doesn't apply to him because he's not trying to coerce women. Women can take it or leave it. They can decide to have a sexual adventure with me or they cannot. And either way, it's not about rejection or acceptance or my ego or anything else he may have said. I'm paraphrasing his thoughts, of course. But the simple, again, very simple concept that's probably hiding in plain sight for most men if they can just get out of their own heads and stop fearing rejection or stop trying to quote unquote get laid, is that perhaps one of the most poignant examples of exactly what you've been talking about this entire episode, Michael, this whole intersection of love and freedom happens right when it's time to get physical with a woman. Most guys are trying to figure out a way to coerce her into bed or quote unquote reel in the biscuit or trying to get laid. Seduction becomes a series of steps designed to trick women into complying. Whereas what David Shade was talking about and what you're talking about is freedom.
Yeah.
Which implies a well-traveled topic around here, which is we want willing women instead of compliant women. We want women who are all in on this. I mean, it's either hell yes or it's no when it comes to women and sex, the way I see it. And as I also see it, I'll tell you what, Michael, I think that's the only way to think if you're a guy who expects to stay out of trouble and in a state of bliss with women sexually. But think about that. If we really love women and we really buy into what you're talking about today, which is this intersection of love and freedom, to take us all to our happy place, if you want me to put it very simplistically, we need to absolutely positively extend freedom to women when we're trying to love them. I mean, again, it sounds so simple, but imagine for a second the consequences, knowing that femininity follows a strong masculine lead and knowing that femininity is physically made horny, turned on physically by a man who causes her to feel safer and more comfortable. And it's almost like you've come up with the magic equation, my friend. How can I make this woman feel more freedom? How can I make her feel more loved and taken care of? Love may be a big, sloppy term, but if you're showing positive concern and giving her the freedom to choose, I would say almost every time you're going to get a pretty good outcome, especially relative to trying to coerce her, trick her, and treating her as some other entity other than fully human, Yeah,
and I want to add something because you mentioned the good old fear phrase of rejection. And so this actually ties in really well to my sort of antidote to rejection, which is totally tied into love and freedom, which is that, and we talked about this previously, where you mentioned how you have guys writing a list of the qualities that they want in a woman. What I like to do is that I like to suggest to men that in advance of knowing if it's there, they're actually appreciating her for at least the potential. So they're actually looking at her in an expanded frame of mind as her ideal self or bigger self or, as her potential. And they look for it. Because guess what we found out through the spiritual law of attraction and through hardcore science is that what you look for, you tend to find more of. So if you set that as an intention up front when you meet a woman or any person up front, is that you're looking for the best self and you're looking for some specific qualities that I think you called it deal breakers for you. Then you're doing something really magical. You're tapping into leadership because you want to tie that into, you want to open up yourself to those things. And when you appreciate her in advance of those things, then she has the freedom to take it or leave it of going with you into that expanded and potential that she have or not. And then there's going to be a take it or leave it for her in terms of, is she willing to step into her bigger self with somebody who have the compassion, who have the leadership in order to be able to be here, with her to do that? Or is she not? If she's not, I would dare to say that she's rejecting herself and not rejecting you.
Or there's no rejection at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's irrelevant because the two of you aren't even compatible.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, what you're getting at there is the idea of having the courage to take inventory on who the hell you are so that you can have a better idea of who you're looking for in terms of the woman you want to be with. And bringing it full circle, Michael, is the idea that if she's done that kind of self-work too, then she's looking for a guy like you, naturally, because the two of you would be compatible.
Or she will realize that this is somebody I should have looked for, and now he's here.
Right. And what I'm getting at here is she's more likely to take it than leave it.
Yeah.
Therefore, you don't even have to worry about rejection so much, because if you're barking up the wrong tree, going after women who aren't right for you, and then you're complaining that they didn't like you and, oh my goodness, I've been rejected, then you're just back in another fear-based mentality. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on this show today, Michael, and talking about this intersection of love and freedom, because I really think you've struck pure gold there. And what I want to do is I want to send these guys to your website, which is actually lovefreedomfirst.com. But I'm also going to give you guys the option, as is my custom, of going to mountaintoppodcast.com/something. In this case, let's make it Love Freedom. 2 words made into one word, LOVEFREEDOM. And what are the guys going to find when they go to that website, Michael?
Well, they're going to find 2 things. They're going to find a link to my songs, which are, all of them are written within this space of putting love and freedom first. And it's really sort of my, you could call it sinister motif, is that I want to influence people in a very positive way. I want to lure them in through, popular culture. In this case, it's music. And I want to invite people to expand their way of feeling and looking at things in terms of love and freedom.
I got to stop you. Only a Scandinavian guy would juxtapose the words sinister and positive in the same sentence.
Yeah, I mean, that's
so Nordic of you.
Maybe that's more my humor. I'm not sure. Or lack of.
Go ahead, man. Finish. Tell us what you got up there.
Yeah, so they're going to find the songs, and then they're going to find my other project, which is the Love Checklist, which is something where I'm creating a one-man show, which is basically half concert, a little bit of teaching, a little bit of storytelling, a little bit of stand-up comedy as well, all with the idea of presenting people a sort of an overall checklist of love that's going to be empowering everybody who gets in contact with it. So there's going to be songs, there's going to be stuff about that love checklist, and perhaps some more. We'll see. It's a work in progress.
Knowing you, I could easily envision either Arlo Guthrie folk music or death metal when envisioning the genre of your music. So lay it on us, man. What kind of music is this?
Well, you're probably going to look at more like a combination of Matchbox 20 and Ed Sheeran and John Mayer, if I have to pick somebody to.
Oh, you really are trying to attract chicks, aren't you?
No, what I want to do ultimately is that I want my first album to be the #1 album that guys put on when they have a chick back home for the first time.
See, you're thinking a chess move ahead of even me. I love that.
Always.
I see what you did there. All right. His name is Michael Lassen, and he's a good friend of mine. As you can see, we talk freely about lots of things. And as you can also fully figure out, if you have been hiding under a rock until now and not listened to the other episodes with him, he's very smart and he's a deep thinker. And we love guys like Michael Lassen around here. So once again, thank you, Michael, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott.
Yeah. And gentlemen, if you haven't been to mountaintoppodcast.com in a while, check out Hero Soap, check out Keyport, check out Jocko Willink's company, Origin in Maine. All of their products from all 3 of those wonderful longtime sponsors of ours are made extremely effectively. They're very good products. They last a long time. They do more than what they say they're going to do. And all 3 of them are based right here in the good old United States of America. When you partake of any of our sponsors' stuff, go ahead and please use the coupon code MOUNTAIN10 to get 10% off. Also, when you go to mountaintoppodcast.com, check out the aforementioned program called Unsettled. A lot of guys really tell me they're sort of scared of that program or they don't see the need for it. Well, I think that's kind of the catch-22. A lot of guys are like, well, you know what? I'm not really in need of a change around here. But do you want the change? What's it going to take for you to want to change things or evolve things or expand things to that next level? We as men strive for that, gentlemen. And that's what Unsettled is all about. The guys who do get their hands on that program, it exceeds their expectations and they're 100% of the time pleased with it. So that's there for you at mountaintoppodcast.com, along with a whole host of other opportunities, including getting on my calendar for 25 minutes to talk about where you are right now compared to where you want to be with women. Gentlemen, a lot of you guys have been asking me lately, well, are you just like every other dating coach or do you have specialties? Listen, I'm generally not the dating coach for beginners. If you're a guy who really is like a 28-year-old virgin and are completely lost when it comes to women, you can get some of my programs and probably solve those problems. Guys who have hired me to be their coach have a puzzle they can't figure out. They have a lot going on, a lot of good things going on, but they're just not getting the right women into their life. That's when they come to see me. A lot of guys who are emerging from abusive relationships, where perhaps they've been gaslit into thinking they're the crazy ones, when really their ex was the one who was diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar 1, and they really feel like they've been damaged by those relationships and they're good and sick of it and they want to emerge stronger and not make those mistakes next time choosing the wrong woman. Those guys come to me. Lately, a lot of guys who are hyper masculine, a lot of guys with a very imposing masculine presence, but still struggle with Mr. Nice Guy stuff, or perhaps even being a little needy. And they're realizing that women cut them very little slack when it comes to that stuff when they have such a hyper masculine presence. I'm having more and more guys come to me who are telling me that story. So if any of that resonates with you, or perhaps you're thinking, hey, you know what? I just love what's going on in this show. I resonate with the whole message in general. Then yeah, man, get on my calendar. Let's talk for 25 minutes. Won't cost you a dime. And if there's a plan of action that we can put in place, well, we'll get it done. All of that is there for you and more at mountaintoppodcast.com. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scot McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.